Well, hi everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another Prescott E-News Prescott Talks. My name is Glenn Martin, and I'm your host. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about the 207 and the marijuana initiative. I know that you might have watched Thursday. I had Sally Schindel here, who we spoke about 207 pretty much in our stories. But I wanted to bring in David Stringer today because David did a presentation at Highway 69 that I thought was very impactful, and it deserves a discussion between us at the table, David, and between friends, and about the effects of marijuana, the effects of Proposition 207. So let me hear what you had to say on that.
First, let me say thank you so much for having me on, Glenn, and of course you were part of the panel the other night at Highway 69, and I was very honored to be invited to come over and do a presentation on Prop 207 and the whole sort of marijuana issue, if you will. It is an issue that I've been involved with most of my adult life. As an attorney, I handled a lot of marijuana cases. And I was practicing law back in Maryland and Washington, D.C., and it was illegal at that time. And I had a lot of clients who were using marijuana. It does contribute, I think, part to the sort of criminal lifestyle, if you will. It's a very common thing that is done by people who are sort of on the wrong side of the law. And so I had a lot of experience with it. I represented a lot of people that used marijuana and some people that that sold it. Mm-hmm. So it's something I know. It's something I've been involved with quite a bit, much more than the average layman, I would say, because of my legal background. And in the legislature, when I was on the Judiciary Committee, I helped found a study group. It was a bipartisan study group on criminal justice. And it was when I was there, it was the only bipartisan study group that was going on that I knew of. And we crafted quite a bit of legislation about criminal justice, and including marijuana. And because I had practiced elsewhere, I was not deeply conversant with the Arizona Criminal Code. And I was very surprised to find out just frankly how harsh and atypical the Arizona Criminal Code really is, but specifically with respect to marijuana, because, and I'm not sure how many of the listeners are aware of this, but Arizona is an outlier among all the states now. We are the only state in the United States that still makes the possession of marijuana, even small amounts of marijuana. Possession of marijuana at any amount can be charged as a felony. And of course, prosecutors like to say, well, we don't do that all the time. Well, they don't do it all the time, but they do it sometimes. And so there are, over the decades that marijuana has been illegal in Arizona, thousands and thousands of people in the state of Arizona, and specifically here in Yavapai County, are carrying felony criminal convictions on their record solely because of the possession of a small amount of marijuana. To me, that's a very bad thing. And we'll get into that a little bit.
Well, let me ask you, and I don't mean to interrupt you on
No, I want you to.
But what is a small amount of marijuana?
Well, a small amount of marijuana can be, even a trace of marijuana can be actually prosecuted. In the context of Prop 207, which defines the amount of marijuana that can be possessed and used recreationally, used for personal use, it's defined as 1 ounce. 1 ounce of less will be legalized in the state of Arizona if Prop 207 passes. Different states, different jurisdictions use different amounts. It's not always 1 ounce. But that's a typical amount. I will say that in the legislature, when we crafted a defelonization bill, it was not fully decriminalized under our proposal. We used a very small amount. I think it was 2.5 grams, which is just a marijuana joint or two, or a marijuana cigarette or two, if you will. So we used a very, very small amount in that particular bill, which did not pass, had a lot of support. We could have pushed it a little harder, but we decided to wait until the next session, and then nothing happened. Yeah. But in any event, you ask what is a small amount of marijuana? Mm-hmm. It's typically an amount of marijuana that a person who uses marijuana might possess that would be exclusively for personal possession. When you start getting up to a half a pound or a quarter pound, then you get into the possibility of possession with intent to distribute or something like that. So not too many drug dealers could make a living out of possessing an ounce at a time.
Well, you know, and I would debate that a little bit, because today's marijuana is so potent that it's not the marijuana of the 60s. I remember back then, an ounce of marijuana was a baggie so thick. But today, you know, you take 2 or 3 drags off a joint or marijuana cigarette, and the potency is so high on this that an ounce will go a long way, you say.
I think that's true, that the marijuana today is sort of a hybrid, if you will, of what we're more familiar with, say, from the 60s or 70s, that over the years, the people who make pot and use pot and cultivate pot, that they have developed stronger and stronger brands or types of marijuana. But I would say this, that although the potency of marijuana has changed, the people who understand that better than anyone are the people who use it. So I like to use the analogy of coffee. You know, there's many different brands of coffee, and of course there's also espresso coffee. Different brands of coffee and espresso coffee are used and consumed differently. So people who use marijuana, they know how potent it is. The other point is that I think there is, just like people who drink regularly have a higher tolerance typically for alcohol than people who don't drink at all or drink only very rarely, that people who use marijuana on a regular basis have a higher tolerance. Somebody who's never used marijuana or hasn't smoked marijuana, you know, since they were a kid or something, and used some current used marijuana that's on the market currently, they might be taken aback about, wow, you know, it really hit me. Well, that's because, in part, because they haven't used marijuana in a long time. I think that one of the most important points to be made in response to that argument, and there's validity to the argument, I'm not denying that at all, but that people who consume marijuana, they understand the potency of their marijuana, and that there has never, to my knowledge, and I Googled this recently, nobody has ever died from an overdose of marijuana. Unlike alcohol, you can die from an overdose of alcohol and many other substances and many other drugs. But marijuana, to my knowledge, has never produced a fatality in and of itself. Now, that's not to say that people who aren't used to marijuana or have no tolerance for it can end up in an emergency room with something that a layman would call an overdose. Right. But there's never been a fatality, to my knowledge. I'm sure the listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but I did Google it recently, and to my knowledge, there's no documented case of somebody actually dying of marijuana.
Only dying from the actions of
From the
using marijuana, the driving under the influence, or...
Well, again, that's, you know, driving under the influence. Any amount of any substance can influence you. You know, you eat too many candy bars and you can be under the influence of sugar. You can have a sugar rush, okay? That doesn't necessarily impair your driving. You can have a glass of wine on your way home or stop for a beer and still drive home safely. We define thresholds for this. And there are tests that law enforcement can use to determine impairment. Obviously, if you're weaving down the road or driving too slow or driving on the curb or something like that, doing something obviously demonstrating an impairment, then they can take action against you. But simply having smoked a little marijuana or or had a beer or a glass of wine, that doesn't necessarily make you impaired.
I would, again, disagree with that, because, again, today's marijuana is not like having a glass of wine or a beer.
No, I understand.
You smoke a little bit of it, and it's a very powerful drug. And one of the things I saw in Colorado last time I visited there, they actually have like these places called bud bars, where you go in and you smoke marijuana, and I don't know, I guess they get back in their car. I don't know how it works, quite honestly, but I thought, what a reckless way of using marijuana is. You go in and you smoke it, or you buy it, or whatever you do, or try it to see how well it works on you. And then you get in your car and go home. And I'm thinking, holy smoke, no wonder they have such a high fatality on their roads since they legalized marijuana.
Well, I think there's some truth to what you're saying, Glenn, but I think it's important to remember that marijuana has been part of our society now for a very long time. It's been illegal, but it's also been widely used. And I developed some numbers on this. Right now, according to the most recent Gallup poll on marijuana usage, indicates about 12% of the adult population will admit to use marijuana on an occasional or even a regular basis. That's a pretty substantial number. That's more than 1 out of 10, 12%. And over half of the U.S. population admits to having used marijuana at some time in their life. So there's a tremendous amount of marijuana available out there. So people have been driving using marijuana all along. I don't know that marijuana is one of the major contributors to highway fatalities. And remember, highway fatalities are actually going down. They've been going down over the last decade or so. They're not going up. I hear this argument though made about how, since Colorado legalized marijuana, and Colorado was one of the 2 first states to legalize marijuana. I believe that was in 2012. Marijuana and the state of Washington both legalized marijuana. And people will complain about that and say, well, their highway fatalities and highway accidents have shot up, and that there's now more marijuana usage among the young, among school kids and things like that. And I think there's probably some truth to that. But there are now 11 states in the United States that have fully legalized marijuana, and the District of Columbia. So I guess that makes 12 jurisdictions. No jurisdiction that has legalized marijuana has ever changed their mind and gone back and criminalized it. Yes, I think there are adverse consequences to using marijuana. I personally don't think marijuana is a good thing. Mm-hmm. I watched my clients over the years who used marijuana. None of them really profited. I think the use of marijuana, particularly the chronic use or habitual use of marijuana, it produces sort of a lethargy. I think it saps initiative. It doesn't help your learning and your higher mental functions. So in a way, it's like alcohol. It doesn't really do you any good at all. Now, maybe in a very small amount at home, it's sort of like a glass of wine. You could smoke a little marijuana and it wouldn't have any major effect. But in general, people who make marijuana part of their life, I don't think they come out ahead. So I'm not an advocate of marijuana use. But the issue in Prop 207 and the issue with legalization of marijuana is not whether or not marijuana is a good thing or a bad thing. That's not the issue. The issue is, do we lock people up for using marijuana? Do we make possession of marijuana a crime? Do we stigmatize people with criminal convictions for using marijuana? Do we put them in jail with all the adverse social consequences that go with sort of a heavy-handed approach to enforcing the marijuana laws? And I think a very strong case can be made that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, that it's a very, very destructive process. Once you get involved in the criminal justice system, it can be a tremendously destructive process. Ending up with a criminal record, even if you don't go to jail, could be a tremendously destructive process and a detriment to your ability to have a successful career. So there may be adverse consequences to using marijuana. I think an argument can be made along those lines. But there are also some extremely severe consequences to our society to enforcing marijuana. We found that out, back in the 20s with alcohol. There's a lot of problems with alcohol. Yeah. There's a lot more DUIs for alcohol than there are for marijuana. There are a lot more fatalities. Alcohol has a tremendously adverse consequence to our society when it's abused. But most people don't abuse it. Some people do. Some people become alcoholics. Some people destroy their lives because of alcohol. But there's a lot of behaviors in our society that have adverse personal consequences and adverse social consequences. Gambling, smoking, obesity. There are many things that people do that harm themselves and have a detrimental effect on our society at large, but we don't put people in jail for that. We don't criminalize that behavior. And I think that's the same argument I think that can be made for legalization of marijuana. Do the adverse consequences of trying to enforce the marijuana law outweigh the adverse consequences to some people who might abuse marijuana?
Do you agree, would you say 207, the current legislation that's out right now, or the initiative, would you agree with that?
I have come to the conclusion that Prop 207 is not the way to go. And I say that not because there aren't some very useful things in the proposition. If I can just, sort of highlight them. One of the criticisms that is made of Prop 207 is that it was sponsored by the industry. It's an industry bill, and was written and sponsored and funded. The campaign to pass 207 funded largely by the marijuana industry. I think that's true, but that's true of a great deal of the legislation in our society. The Chamber of Commerce proposes legislation that's pro-business. The Medical Association proposes legislation that's what they believe is good for themselves and good for the healthcare industry. The law enforcement and the county prosecutors, the state prosecutors, they propose legislation that they think is going to be favorable to their personal interests. So every special interest in our society has a right to access the legislative process and voter initiatives. So I don't think there's anything unusually bad, anything unusual about or particularly damning in the fact that the marijuana industry drafted the bill. I think it's up to the voters to decide whether or not there's enough good things in this bill to pass it, or that there are some problems with the bill and that they shouldn't support it. And I think that's an individual decision. But I think in fairness to viewers, I should state my position on this. And while I am someone who has been active in the criminal justice reform movement, I support criminal justice reform. I don't think marijuana should be against the law. I will say that. Small amounts, recreational use, personal possession of small amounts of marijuana. The adverse consequences of criminalization are outweighed by the benefits of legalization. In other words, that I think that trying to enforce these laws have many adverse consequences and that we probably should not do it. But Proposition 207 is a voter initiative. Every law in the state, just about every law in the state of Arizona, everything that's criminalized in the state of Arizona was done by the legislature. That's how we pass our laws, and the legislature can criminalize something or decriminalize something depending on the facts at hand. We learn over time about how our laws are working, and from time to time we have to change those laws. But when we pass a voter initiative like 207, we take that ability out of the hands of the legislature. So I think as a general matter, it is not good public policy for the voters to be in creating laws and creating crimes or decriminalizing things through a voter initiative process, because it takes it out of the hands of the legislature. Once a voter initiative has passed, it takes a 3/4 vote of the legislature to make any changes to that law, and any changes they do make, even if they get to the 3/4 vote threshold, has to be to further the purpose of the voter initiative. So it really locks Arizona in on a specific set of rules about the legalization of marijuana that I think are overly restrictive, tie the hands of the legislature, make it too difficult to make changes. And if you want to interrupt me at any point, please do, because I'll just talk all afternoon here.
Not a problem. I was going to come up with a 3/4 vote. Have you ever seen a 3/4 vote for anything in the legislature?
And one did come up that was close, and it dealt with marijuana. Medical marijuana is legal. I think, was it 2008, 2010?
2010, I believe.
2010, thank you. And marijuana, the medical marijuana is taxed, and the tax revenue, part of that tax revenue goes into a special fund that is to be used for voter education, marijuana treatment, drug treatment, things of that nature. And that money is piling up. and the legislature has never been able to agree on how to spend the money. One of the provisions, by the way, of Prop 407 is to take $45 million out of that fund and use it for drug treatment and for law enforcement, and to finance the expungement provisions of Prop 207 and so on. But anyway, we did have I think Representative Leach sponsored the bill and twisted my arm very, very hard to get me to go along with it. But no, we could not reach the three-quarter
So
threshold.
when we vote in a proposition like 207, it's there. It's never going to go away.
I can't think of any that have been
How
off
would
the
be-
top
how
who have
would-
been repealed, or that the legislature has effectively been able to kind of change through a three-quarter vote. I can't think of one off the top.
And the tax structure for 207 is that they say 16% of the marijuana sales
Yes.
goes to the taxes.
So as I read,
But you cannot increase that. So if the cost to society is more than 16%, whatever that money number is, we have to go to the legislature to get a 3/4 vote to change that, to move it up, or would we be able to?
you would not be able to. I'm not sure. I think there'd be an argument that increasing the tax was not in furtherance of the purpose of the initiative, so there could be a lawsuit over whether or not the legislature could increase or decrease that 16% tax. Just for viewer clarification here, what Prop 207 provides is that the sale of marijuana through a legal dispensary would be taxed by the local jurisdiction at their normal sales tax. There'd be the regular sales tax that we apply to any product that's taxed, any commodity that's taxed. And then on top of that would be a 16% sales tax that would go into a special fund that would be used to fund such things as community colleges, law enforcement, education, a number of other things. So it's laid out, and it's not a bad formula. 30% goes here, 30% goes there, 25% goes here. So it's not necessarily a bad formula, but it is set in stone. So it can't be tweaked. So if
We don't know if it's going to cover the costs or not.
well, we don't know what the cost
Would be.
But remember, Glenn, if we are legalizing something, why would that increase the cost of enforcement? Obviously, it wouldn't. Now, there might be collateral situations.
That's my point.
That's your point.
My
Okay.
point is, what is the cost on our community? Not on law enforcement, I get that. But when we look at Colorado, which is basically the petri dish of the marijuana laws, we see that a lot more money is going into hospitalization, community services due to the use of marijuana.
All right. I don't have specific numbers on that. I have heard that argument, and I'm not in a position to refute it, that there are some social costs associated with legalization of marijuana, that you get higher youth usage, that you get higher traffic fatalities and accidents on the road, things of that nature, that can drive up insurance costs and things of that nature. So I get that argument, and I think there's probably something to it. But again, what are the costs of enforcing the marijuana laws that we have now? We have to jail people. We have to pay cops. We have to pay probation officers. We have to pay judges and court personnel. We have the stigma of criminal conviction that diminishes people's employment opportunity. Remember now, in Arizona, possession of marijuana, even small amounts, is a felony. And with a felony record, you are disqualified from many activities. You can't vote. In Arizona, felons can't vote. Felons can't serve on a jury. Felons can't get licensed for certain occupations. It'd be very difficult to be a doctor or a lawyer or a CPA or a school teacher. There'd be many occupations that are closed to you because of a felony convictions. So that's a social cost as well. So yes, I think there could be some medical issues associated, or some societal costs associated with the legalization of marijuana. But again, no state, and there's now 11 of them, no state that has legalized marijuana has changed their mind. And by the way, it isn't just states that have legalized marijuana. Countries have legalized marijuana.
But when you say they didn't change their mind, are they under the same 3/4? If we vote this in, we're not going to be able to change our mind either.
I agree with
right?
that. That's why I'm not a yes vote on 207, and it's not because there aren't some good things in in the voter initiative with respect to legalization, I think absolutely marijuana should not be a felony. I think that's a very bad public policy that we've been following here in Arizona for far too long. The bill also, the voter initiative also provides for the expungement of criminal records. So for people, and I believe there are many thousands of them in the state of Arizona who are carrying felony convictions on their record solely because they were caught with marijuana. They might have been 19 years old and in a car with friends smoking some pot, and they ended up with a felony on their record, but that's the only thing that they've ever done. And now they're 30 or 40 years old. They've got families trying to support their families, buy homes and so on like that. Get ahead in life, but that felony record holds them back. So Proposition 207 allows them to petition the court. It's not an automatic expungement. Requires them to petition the court to get that matter expunged. And the county attorney, the state's attorney, has an opportunity to object. So if somebody who has a felony conviction for marijuana but is still kind of living a shady lifestyle, maybe a gang member or something like that, the county attorney can bring that to the attention of the court, and the court could deny the petition. But as a general matter, people who have felony convictions for marijuana, and that's all they have, that they'll be able to get those things expunged.
Let's go back to the impact it has on society. I mean, as far as legalization.
Sure.
I am against legalization of marijuana for a lot of reasons. One is because I lost my son, and you know that, and to a drug overdose. Now, true, it wasn't marijuana, but marijuana and alcohol were both gateway drugs into the situation. I was on the Sober Home Committee. I listened to a lot of recovering people, and that was the most common place, was marijuana and alcohol. So my point is, David, alcohol's brought a lot of hardship, a lot of heartbreaks to
Absolutely.
Our society. What benefit does it to bring in another intoxicant that very possibly could destroy families and communities?
The answer to first, let me say that I'm acknowledging, and I think any reasonable person would acknowledge, that marijuana can be abused and can have some adverse consequences. I don't see how any reasonable person could dispute that. But as I say, there are many things that people do that are harmful to themselves that we don't criminalize. So the issue, again, is not whether or not marijuana is a good thing or a bad thing. The issue is whether or not we make it a crime, whether or not we make it a felony, whether or not we expend huge social resources to try to stamp it out. Remember now, we've had the war on drugs now for many, many decades, and it doesn't seem to be doing any good. And I will say that here in Arizona, and specifically in Yavapai County, we have had a very, very serious and sustained effort to stamp out marijuana for decades. And in 2020, today, marijuana is more available and more used than it ever has been, and it's legal. And that it's illegal. So making something illegal doesn't necessarily eliminate its usage. There are tremendous social costs to having crimes on the books that become basically unenforceable.
I'm sorry. I want to get into decriminalization a little bit more,
sure.
But I think that if we put it on the corner, of our streets for sale, recreational marijuana I'm speaking of, I think that would absolutely increase the usage of it.
Well,
I'm not saying that somebody with a medical card, I know they sell a little bit of their dope to people within their families
within
and
their
streets,
own network, yeah.
And I know that there's a black market for marijuana, and that's not going to go away whether it's decriminalized or not, and that's a whole nother discussion. But if we allow that to be, let's say, every quarter mile or mile, I don't know what the restrictions were, how many places within the community you could buy.
It's spelled out, and I'll tell you in a minute.
Yeah, I know it's in the bill, I just don't recall it. I forgot my cheat sheet.
Sorry.
But
I'll help you.
does that not increase the opportunity to purchase marijuana and use it, especially to our younger people?
Well, a couple of points in response to that. And first, let me say that if we legalize something and there are no criminal sanctions whatsoever, then it stands to reason that it's more easy to get and that people might use it more than they currently do. I think that's entirely possible. But again, that doesn't mean they're using it, doesn't mean they're going to be abusing it. The bill, the voter initiative, does not provide for anybody to sell marijuana on a street corner. The bill does not provide for anybody under the age of 21 to have, possess, and use marijuana legally. The bill limits and controls the marijuana availability through dispensaries. And the formula is, as I read the voter initiative, it's 10 to 1. It's based on the number of pharmacies that we have in a given community. For every 10 pharmacies, a marijuana dispensary can be licensed. That doesn't mean it will be licensed, but that's the formula, 10 to 1. So that means that, how many pharmacies do we have here?
We have a bunch because we're a retired community, and
Yes,
let me
but
tell
we
you,
don't
we
have
have a
hundreds.
lot.
We don't have hundreds of pharmacies. We may have several dozen
Right,
pharmacies.
right.
And so that means there could be, in a city the size of Prescott, there could be 3 or 4 marijuana dispensaries. I don't know how many pharmacies we have, but that's the formula, 10 to 1.
Yeah.
So we're not going to have marijuana being sold on every street corner. The other thing is that the dispensaries have to be licensed, and they have to be selling a product that has been tested and approved. In other words, one of the problems with marijuana now is that it is a bootleg kind of product. People are growing it in their basements and grow fields and things like that, and being brought into the country from Mexico. They keep catching people coming across the border with backpacks.
Absolutely,
full of
black market.
Right.
Black
And there's
market's
all
huge.
kinds of
and they have that in California,
Right.
in all these states that are legalized. They still
Well,
have black market.
There may be
It
some
didn't go
black
away.
market, but it's but most people are not going to take the risk of buying black market marijuana when they can buy it legally. All right, so you can argue that with any product. I mean, I think moonshine whiskey probably still gets made, but most people don't buy moonshine because they can just go to a liquor store and buy stuff that's tested, and they know it's reputable. So with respect to the marijuana availability, it's going to be. It has to be packaged in a certain way. It has to be tested. It's going to be regulated, and it's going to be taxed. And the availability of it is going to be limited. It does in no way, shape, or form legalize marijuana for anybody under the age of 21. And I want to speak to that point because I know it's one of the criticisms that's made. If you legalize it, then the kids are going to get a hold of it. The kids already have it. They've had it all along. There's not a school in Arizona, not a school in Yavapai County, maybe not elementary schools, but middle and high schools and colleges in Arizona where marijuana is not readily available. There's no high school kid or college kid in the state of Arizona who can't get their hands on some marijuana if they want to. Mm-hmm. Now, most of them don't. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the marijuana usage is among high school and college kids, but I don't think it's 100%. I don't think it's 50%. No. It may be 10 or 15 or 20%. But the point is this: if they want it, they can get it. Yeah. That's the point. Then the other point is that, they argue, the people who are opposing marijuana, that it's going to affect their development because neurologically the adolescent brain is still developing and so on. And that's probably true. But that's true with anything. Mm-hmm. That's true with any substance. That's true with cigarettes. That's true with beer. That's true with anything that they might do.
Yeah, but I don't know of anyone that has psychosis from beer or from cigarettes.
Glenn, there are admissions to the regional medical center every year, probably every month, for someone who has overdosed on
alcohol.
On alcohol.
Yeah.
Alcohol is a far more serious and potent drug than marijuana, and that lends itself to abuse much more readily.
But the psychosis, the psychology part of it, I'm not sure. And I don't have the data for it, but I do know that psychosis is a problem with the marijuana.
I've heard that argument that certain people are more susceptible to psychosis because of marijuana. But Glenn, we've had marijuana in our society for decades. How many people are in mental institutions, are under treatment for psychosis due solely to marijuana? All right. So people who have mental health issues may gravitate to alcohol or gravitate to marijuana or be compulsive smokers or compulsive eaters and things like that and develop health problems because of their mental health situation. But I don't think you can say that in and of itself that the marijuana is contributing to psychosis on any kind of a large scale basis.
But it
okay?
only takes one, and this is
Yeah.
my argument.
Well, no,
David.
wait a minute, Glenn, now, it only takes one.
it
Do you mean
takes-
that we're gonna criminalize our entire society just because someone, somewhere, might suffer an adverse consequence to marijuana? We don't do that with obesity. We don't do that with alcohol. We don't do that with smoking. There are all kinds of harmful, potentially harmful behaviors that we don't criminalize. Why do we single out marijuana for criminalization when it has no more adverse consequences than many other things that we
But I think
that
what
are
we're
legal?
talking two sides here is decriminalization.
Yes.
Which I would agree with you that, we should decriminalize the use of marijuana. And I mean, for small amounts, I mean, like you said, every kid that's 19 years old, we're gonna prosecute them and put them in jail for a felony. That I could agree with. But we're talking about full-blown legalization of marijuana. And if we're gonna do that, we're going to open Pandora's box and allow this, another intoxicant, on the streets of our communities. The effects of that, whether it's one or two people or, when it's somebody in your family, of course, that's a big deal. I understand the overall, not everybody who smokes pot looks forward to smoking pot the next day, but there are those people out there that have an addictive personality and they look forward to smoking pot the next day.
I think you're right.
So
I-
are we going
Yeah.
to put this out so everybody can have it and affect of whatever the percentage is? I'm not going to pull a number out of the air, but a percentage of our population that indeed would have a problem with it.
I agree that there are such things as addictive personalities. I've done enough reading in psychology and had enough life experience to know that some people are more susceptible to these kinds of things than others. But again, it gets back to the issue of what do we do about this? Okay? Marijuana is part of our society. Many people like to use marijuana. Over 50% of the American population acknowledges that having used it at some point in their life. Currently, 12% of the American population admits to using marijuana on a regular basis, or at least on a more than occasional basis. So I want to get back to the issue here, though, with criminalization and the impact on young people. Because marijuana is in our schools, and I think that's probably an unfortunate thing. But it's reality. And so what do you do about it? When you go to young people and you say, this marijuana stuff, this is really bad for you. It's going to affect your schoolwork. It's going to, diminish your opportunities in life. It produces a lethargy. It's going to interfere with your social life. Has all kinds of adverse, and if you get caught, you're going to get a criminal record. All kinds of adverse consequences. It's going to hold you back. And the kids will laugh at you because they know people who smoke pot. They know they have siblings and older friends that have gone on to college and are doing very well in life. Okay? I grew up in Alaska back in the 50s and 60s. And there was a time when Alaska was a territory, and then shortly after it became a state, where marijuana was not against the law. Now, I was a kid, and it wasn't common, but some people were using it, and it was completely legal. And I know that a lot of these people who used marijuana in Alaska back in the 50s and early 60s, when it was not criminally enforced, have gone on to become very successful people. All right, some of them went to medical school. They became successful businessmen and so on like that. I was practicing law back in Washington, D.C. In the 1980s when President Reagan appointed Judge Ginsburg to the Supreme Court. And he was on I believe it was the D.C. Court of Appeals. And I had some cases with the D.C. Court of Appeals. I knew Judge Ginsburg, at least knew about him. I had some contact with him. And I was very surprised to learn, by the way, he didn't get the Supreme Court nomination. They withdrew his nomination because it turned out that when Judge Ginsburg was teaching at Harvard, young teaching assistant at Harvard, not only did he use marijuana, but he sold marijuana to other kids, right? To other Harvard students, right? And then he went on, of course, to finish law school and become a renowned justice on the D.C. Court of Appeals. So, and there's example after example of highly successful people in our society who use marijuana. Using marijuana will not keep you out of Harvard or MIT or Berkeley or keep you from having a successful career. And kids know that. So when you tell them how bad marijuana is for them, a lot of them will just shrug their shoulders and laugh. That doesn't mean they all smoke marijuana. Okay, just like, they can get beer. We all know that. Kids can get beer. Judge Kavanaugh told us about, when he was 15 years old going to beer parties, okay? Well, that happens in our society, and that probably happens right here in Prescott, Arizona. But when you start telling kids that marijuana is sort of a, try to demonize the possession and use of marijuana, they laugh at you, and the law loses its moral authority. In order to have a successful criminal code, in order to enforce our laws, people have to, basically, there has to be a broad social consensus. So everybody agrees, even thieves agree that stealing should be wrong. Even burglars agree, I don't want my house burglarized. So there's a broad social consensus on most of our criminal code. But with respect to marijuana, that consensus is broken down. And what that means is that the law has lost its moral authority. It can still be enforced. Cops still have badges and guns, and they can lock you up. But they don't have, with respect to marijuana, they have lost their moral authority to a broad segment of the population. And that's a very damaging thing, I think, to our society and to our confidence and trust in the police. So I think that's a very important consideration.
I think a lot of the kids in college or schools and high schools, I think you're right. I think there's a group of people there that probably do smock and laugh about the use of marijuana. And again, they don't know anybody who had adverse effects of marijuana. They see a lot of people like you saw, people who it didn't affect. But or not affect. I'm sorry.
I never used marijuana.
I know. Not you.
I had clients who used marijuana.
Thank you.
My
Thank you
brother
for
used a little
clarifying that.
marijuana.
But that's what I meant. People that you knew who used marijuana, it didn't affect them. But I think that now I've kind of lost my thought. I didn't mean to do that to you, David. But and then there's a group that would never use marijuana. A lot of the sportsters and the people who want to, go into law enforcement or what have you. But you know what? My reaction to that is I've talked to a lot of those kids that said it never would harm them. I've talked to them in the rehab homes. I've talked to them on the streets. I actually tried to help some of the kids get back home because they were thrown out of rehabs right here in Prescott. So, again, it's a negative consequence of this drug that, it's not going to affect everybody. And there's going to be successful people that use it. But there's also going to be a lot of people that go on to harder drugs, or it damages their lives, or it damages their marriage, or it damages their family. And ultimately, the community pays for it.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you say there. And so I'm not here to say that marijuana is good for you or that marijuana doesn't have any adverse consequences. I think it does. I'm solely here to point out that there are very, very serious consequences to trying to enforce a law that many people simply don't support, and that we pay a price as a society when we do that. As I said, Arizona is now the only state in the union where the possession of marijuana at any amount is a felony. And believe me, I think that costs us. That carries a tremendous price for our society. We're having a big debate in our community right now, Glenn, and you're part of that debate, I think, about whether or not we should build a new jail, or should we build a new jail. One of the and of course the argument is that, well, they're getting crowded over there in the Verde Valley. One of the reasons they're getting crowded over there in the Verde Valley is because of the marijuana laws. All right, we do lock up people in Yavapai County for marijuana. There are a lot of people in jail. I think about 20% of the population, the jail population in the Verde Valley, is there for technical violations of one kind or another, not for new crimes, but for technical violations of one kind or another. And very often those technical violations are, well, they submitted a urine sample that had marijuana or something along those lines. So we do have people in jail for marijuana use, and it costs us a lot. $110 a day. $110 a day, about $300 every time the police arrest somebody and book them. It's about $300 to process them. $110 a day to house them. That's over $40,000 a year. And now we're looking at an $86 million jail, 110 beds for $86 million. And that's not solely because of marijuana, but marijuana is a factor. If we didn't criminalize and lock up people for marijuana, that would free up some jail beds. That would diminish the overcrowding in our county jail. So anyway,
I'm going to let you finish this up, and I'm going to throw the last thought. Is You know, we always it's a felony or we have 207 over here. Why can't we ever go down the middle and just say, okay, let's decriminalize it. Let's not prosecute people for small amounts of marijuana. I know California, I think it's an infraction now, a ticket. But after a while, you start getting too many tickets, then yeah, you're going to be prosecuted. We can never get into the middle of something, David. So I want to finish up this discussion, you and I. And I thank you so much for coming in. And
Happy
I
to
think
do
it's
it.
been a good, productive discussion. But I want you just to end our talking with about the decriminalization of marijuana.
Sure.
Where are we at on that? Can we see that anytime in the future? Hopefully 207 does not pass. If it doesn't, do you see decriminalization coming down the pipe?
I hope so, and thank you for letting me finish on that point. When I was in the legislature, I believe in 2018, our criminal justice study group, we drafted a bill dealing with possession of small amount of marijuana, and our bill was not a full legalization. This was a bipartisan group, by the way. The Democrats agreed with this. We had legislation that would have changed the penalty for possession of marijuana, small amounts of marijuana, from a felony to a civil infraction for the first offense, simply a fine. For a second offense, it would have been a petty misdemeanor, that is, would carry up to 30 days in jail, and I believe it's about a $500 fine. And then the third offense would be a level 1 misdemeanor, which carries up to 6 months in jail, I believe, and about a $500 fine. In any event, that was my approach. I'm an incrementalist. Legalization and decriminalization of marijuana is still new. Colorado did it in 2012. California just did it this year, 2020. So it's a relatively new thing for us, and we're still learning about the side effects, the collateral consequences, the unintended consequences of legalization or decriminalization. So my proposal would be to kind of take a step in the direction of defelonizing it, letting first offenders off with a civil infraction, giving people an opportunity to get their records expunged for simple possession of marijuana, but not a full-blown legalization as proposed by 207. Maybe someday, but I would take a small first step first, and I would have that done through the legislature and not through a voter initiative, which locks our state into what may have some very unfortunate consequences down the road. All right. Thanks so much for having
Thank
me.
you,
It's been a
David.
pleasure.
That was great. It was a great discussion, and as always, I want to thank you for tuning in. We always end our show with thanking our current serving and prior serving military. Thank you so much for allowing us the freedom to sit at the table and have these types of discussions. I also like to thank the law enforcement and firefighters keeping our streets safe. We certainly appreciate everything that you folks do, and we always have your back. And with that, Prescott, we'll talk soon, and take care.